Let you know a little bit about what we're going to do today. So as I told you last week, we're going to talk about listening and listening to youth and what that means. And we're going to explore this a little bit through film and a little bit through conversation. So I'll let you know who our special guests are. So we have Aaron Christopher. He is the director and writer of the film Listen, which we're going to talk about and see a little clip of. Hi, Aaron. And then we also have Graham Bodie, who is here with us from Mississippi, who is the Chief Listening Officer of the Listen First project. And he will let you know a bit more about what that is. Would the two of you like to say anything else?
Just excited to be here, and thanks for the opportunity and for taking time out of your day to be a part of this.
Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's just great to see people from all over join. Somebody, I private messaged her. I saw somebody was from Memphis, so right up the road from me. So it's good to not only have wide variety, but someone close to feel like I'm talking to somebody right across the street. So welcome.
Excellent. That's right. And Aaron, I forgot to say you're in Montreal.
Yeah, Montreal.
All right. Well, without further ado, we can go ahead and get started.
Fantastic. Well, again, it's really a pleasure to be here and excited to share a clip from the film and talk about what really guided the creation of it. I've been fortunate enough to work in education for the last 14 years. My segue into education was quite unorthodox. It started with a reaction to a national tragedy, the Columbine High School shooting. And when that happened, like I imagine everybody on this Zoom call was deeply affected by it. And I think most people were really struggling with the question of why. And what I noticed when that happened is that no one was asking the youth that question. And if they asked the youth the question, it was really of, were you there? Did you see it? But not really, why do you think this could happen? And mind you, I was really glad we got insight from so many experts, but I feel like the youth are on the campus and they're an expert in their own right because they're living it. And so I basically embarked on a project to give 5 diverse youth video cameras and let them film their life to see what they had to say. And a long story short, that turned into a 5-part educational film series, and then me being on over 1,250 high school and middle school campuses all over the United States and Canada over 10 years of my life. And what I was trying to do was give the youth a voice, challenge them to think differently, and inspire them to want to make a difference in the world through their action. But I learned after 10 years that the one thing I kept hearing over and over again from the youth was that they would say, no one listens to me. Whether I was in Rome, Italy, Warsaw, Montreal, Los Angeles, Sacramento, California, Indiana, wherever I went, there was always a youth after the program that would come up to me and say, no one really listens. And the other thing I realized is that I was focusing on issues like bullying, school violence, body image and self-esteem, parent-family communication, substance abuse. I realized that what I was also doing is kind of alienating youth from the conversation because we were hyper-focusing on one specific issue rather than trying to talk about an issue that connected everyone. Because there would always be a youth that says, well, I don't drink or use drugs, so what does this have to do with me? And it's difficult to tell a student, maybe not today, but maybe some point in your life. But they tune out if it doesn't appeal to what's on their mind. So I actually left the organization that I had co-founded and created to focus on this subject that I felt would connect all of these issues. And I, as a filmmaker, have been fortunate enough to be afforded the opportunity to talk with a lot of counselors and psychologists about the issues. And I got really focused on trauma and the impact. And I also started to realize that the umbrella that encapsulates all of these issues that I was previously focusing on was mental health. And it was a subject that nobody wanted to talk about. And I started to think about how could we approach this subject in a way, in a stealth-like way that made it very easy for people to talk about it. Because I think a lot of times when you say mental health, people think mental illness. And once you say that, then they think stigma, and everybody doesn't want to talk about it. And so how could we provoke a conversation that was really accessible And what I started to do is write a feature film that I called Listen. And the reason I called it Listen was because, as I said, so many students were telling me no one really listens. And for 10 years, I had the definition of that word all wrong. If we look it up in the dictionary right now, you'll see that the definition of listen, you'll find, is probably to give one's attention with your ear. But if you dig deeper on the meaning of that word, you're going to find a Germanic word, hallucinin, which simply means pay attention to. It doesn't say pay attention with your ears. It says pay attention. And if you think about how we can pay attention today, our senses, we have so many. They're not just our ears. We have our eyes, our ears, our sense of smell, taste, touch. And so what I started to realize is that over time, we have basically reshaped the definition of the word listening to simply mean hearing. And we have slowly lost sight of what the real art of listening is. And that's seeing, hearing, thinking, and feeling. And so what I did is I wanted to craft a film that really provoked us all to realize how important active listening really is in our lives. And the whole point of the film and the initiatives that we launched around the film itself and the curriculum that we developed was really focused on two simple things. And the two things I would like you to think about and ponder today and every day of your life after this session. And it's number one is, how do you define listening? And number two, how do you do it? And do you feel, if we, after this session today, that it's necessary to start redefining it? And is it necessary to change how we do it? So you're seeing a poll on the screen right now. I'm curious how many of you have seen the film. And it looks like most of you haven't. So you're in for a treat, because I'm going to show you right now the beginning of the film, which is going to include the opening and also the first scene. And what I would like you to do as you're watching this is really think about what I said about how we need to redefine what listening is. It's seeing, hearing, thinking, and feeling. And what I'd like to ask you is, what do you see, hear, think, and feel as you're watching this clip? And then what I want to do is convene back here and engage in a short dialogue about what it is that all of you actually saw, heard, thought, or felt while you watched this. So hopefully technology will not fail me. I'm going to share the screen and I'm going to start the clip. And one thing I'd like to add before I show this, this film was actually inspired by the 10 years of work that I did in schools. Every character in this film is made up of a conglomeration of 2 to 3 people that I met, know. And the stories are inspired by kernels of real stories that I basically turned into my own. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and show you the beginning of Listen. Oh, I think it didn't work, so let me try this.
Or has it worked in the test right before we launched, right?
Yeah. Okay, I think that worked. Can everybody see it? Okay, here we go.
New evidence was released today by the San Marcos County Sheriff's Department in connection with the tragic murder-suicide that happened at New Haven High School 2 weeks ago. Several blogs provided graphic details of severe bullying and hopeless attempts to seek help from school officials. Experts believe the teen suffered from severe depression and harbored thoughts of suicide.
It was a stolen scene this morning as students from New Haven arrived to take classes and cope with the
He's going to hell because of raising kids like that. Maybe there's something we don't know about him. Well, he killed 5 kids and then killed himself, Josh. What else do you need to know? What made him do it? So you're a psychologist now?
No, I don't think we should judge him based upon what other people say. It doesn't make sense at all.
Josh,
I don't know
Josh,
do that.
He's a sociopath, a psycho. He was sick in the head. Isn't that enough? The world doesn't need him. Listen, there are no excuses for crap like this. Not the media, not the parents, nothing. You understand?
Yeah. I gotta go.
So that's the first scene of the film. And I'd like to go back to that question I asked. And Laura, I would, defer to you whether the answers should come from chat or we can engage in it straight through discussion. But I'm curious from the group, what did you see, hear, think, or feel?
And I invite you to do either. You guys know how to raise your hands. Jenna can unmute you, or you can put down in the chat. Both are fine with me. And while people are sharing in, I was remiss in always thanking and introducing my colleagues, Jenna Quinn and Sis White from ACES Connection. Sis is going to help me with the chat and facilitation.
Great. So I'm reading the chat. Shut down, like he was shut down. A resistance between father and son. I felt frustrated for him because he couldn't voice his feelings. Labeling, passing judgment, no space, conversation. I feel anger, judge, anger. Rigid thinking adult. This is all great. I want you to think about what specific things that you saw too. What else did you see happen? Because remember, listening is seeing, hearing, thinking, and feeling. Dad not listening, speaking over child. So Alma, you nailed it. In that first scene, we basically see exactly how a simple moment of communication can be so important to the trajectory of someone's life. That's the first scene of the film, and the film's about 1 hour and 48 minutes long. And that moment has a significant impact on Josh, the main character's life, moving forward. The one thing that Josh says in that opening scene is very key. He's basically telling us exactly what we should not do the entire time you're watching the movie. And I'm curious if anybody identified exactly what he said to his father. It's basically something that we as human beings have a very difficult time doing. Does anybody recall what he said? We don't need to judge. He says that to his father. I just don't think we should judge. Now, when I deliver trainings in active listening, that's the one thing that I'm always pointing out. Psychologists have illustrated that we have an attention span of 8 seconds. I think that attention span is actually shrinking dramatically because of technology. But originally, 8 seconds was the attention span of a human being. But they also illustrated that it takes 7 seconds for a human being to judge another person. So we have 1 second to actually listen. 1 second to truly see, hear, think, and feel what the other person could be going through, so we can actually remove that judgment and truly connect. And that, for me, is what listening is all about. And what we'd like to do right now is allow this group to break off into smaller groups to discuss the impact of listening on your life. What I'd like you to ponder is, Can you think of a moment in your life where someone did not listen to you? They didn't see you, they didn't hear you, they didn't think about what you might be going through. They didn't feel maybe possibly what you were feeling. What was that moment like in your life, and what happened after that moment? And how did it impact your trajectory? I also want you to think about, was there an instance where you did not listen to someone? You did not see exactly what their body language was telling you? Or maybe you weren't really hearing them or feeling what they might be going through. I want you to have a discussion about those two sides, and then we'll come back and share about that. And the one thing I want you to leave you with is that I said that scene defines a critical moment in Josh's life. And if you go on and watch the film, and I think for the 10% of you that did watch the film, you understand how Josh's trajectory led to a lot of pain and suffering. And if Josh's father would have truly taken a moment to listen, it would have changed his narrative completely. So with that, Laura, I think it would be a good idea to break off.
Great. Jenna's going to put you into small groups of probably 4, and we'll have about 8 minutes or so. So make sure to introduce yourselves. And I'm going to stay here. I hope that was beneficial. I got some thumbs up. Good, good. Glad to hear it. I'll give it the breakout rooms take a few minutes to close, or 1 minute to close out. So we'll give everybody a little time before we get going again. I put in the chat the blog post for this event, which gives you the instructions on how to watch the film, because several of you asked me how to watch the movie. So go to the blog post for this, and there's like all the links to their bios, their organizations, and how to watch the film.
Can you put that in again when everybody gets back? Because I think chat deletes itself once you go to breakout rooms. Actually.
Yes, I will. Absolutely. Thanks, Jenna. And I'll do it again at the end too. All right. Are all the rooms closed, Jenna? Do you think?
I think so. Let me double check. Yep, they're all closed.
Okay, great. Go for it.
So before I hand it over to Graham, I just want to go back to that scene in particular. And if you think about that scene, it's a simple conversation, happens at the breakfast table. Maybe some of you have actually been a part of a conversation like that. But if you think about what happens after that conversation, there's a physical action. Josh leaves the room. And initially, what was kind of interesting is the father is making a snide comment kind of about the radio. The world's going to hell because of crazy kids like that. And Josh tries to engage, but maybe there's something we don't know about him. Which he's basically saying to his father, I actively want to have a conversation with you about this, and I might have a different view. But the father cuts him down, judges him, mocks him, calls him, what are you, a psychologist now? And then kills that conversation. And at the end of it, Josh leaves. And I think that's what's at stake when listening does not happen. And what we talked about in our little discussion group was how, oftentimes we just don't put the importance on this simple act because it's something we do every single day. But what I've learned through doing this project and rethinking what that word really means and practicing changing how I do it is you see how that simple act is actually the beginning of the development of the relationships that you have. And I've got 2 younger daughters. And when I was making the film, they were even younger than they are right now. And I noticed, like, my youngest is now 7, but when I was making it, she was, 5 going on 6. She talks nonstop. And it goes in one ear and sometimes out the other, and you don't realize that, okay, well, she could be talking about fairies or turtles or whatever it is, but we try to tune out. But if I tune out, I've noticed that she tunes out when I ask her something. She tunes out when I want her to pay attention. At 5 years old, she knows that. She knows that if you want my connection, you have to give me your connection. And that's where I think that this topic, this is so important now more than ever, especially because our connections are kind of broken due to the circumstances. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Graham, who has become a great friend and just so incredibly inspired by the work he's doing around listening through his particular organization, the Listen First Project.
Thanks, Aram. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time talking, just to give a little bit of background of what our organization attempts to do and how Aram and I sort of, got in contact with each other. So I help run an organization called Listen First Project. It's a nonprofit organization. And we basically exist to, what we say, amplify, aggregate, and align all the many efforts across the country and really across the globe that seek to, as we say, mend the frayed social fabric, one conversation at a time. We have about 325 organizations within that larger Listen First coalition, some of which, like the movie Listen, and Aram's project, and some others like Urban Confessional and Someone to Tell It To and Hear Me app. And there's probably about 12 to 15 that deal in this mental health, wellness, sort of listening on a personal or relationship level. And then there's another group of organizations that deal in polarization, usually political polarization, but it's not always political. It's sometimes urban-rural divide, and there's divisions within, race and ethnicity, and then of course between, the red and the blue teams at this point, moving into an election season, which get heightened by media and so forth. The scene with the dad and the son is interesting from the perspective of what is listening and what are some ways in which we might sort of teach our youth how to do it better and to make sure that they feel heard. It sort of illustrates for me two primary things that we work on at Listen First Project. The first is the relationship. So the relationship between the father and the son, and you can extrapolate this to relationships between, teachers and students, parents and teachers, administration and teachers. It really doesn't matter what the relationship is. And somebody in our group said it pretty well, that when you're a listener, when you're in a conversation in that role, it's not about you, it's about the other person. And really, it's not fully about the other person, it's about the relationship. And so the way in which you react, the way in which you respond as a listener, not only sends a message at the level of the content of that message, like it tells them dictionary definition, add them all up. It tells them how you see them as a person and how you see that relationship, whether you value that relationship, whether you respect them as a person, whether you think that their opinion matters, and so forth. So the first thing that scene helps me understand about listening is that it's all about relationships. It's all about strengthening relationships through better listening. And the second thing it illustrates is this notion of perspective. Clearly the father is coming from one sort of ideological life experience sort of, perspective, where he thinks, in his words, sort of the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right? He feels like, and you can see this, you can see this in the media, which, do fear mongering every day. You can see this in all kinds of ways, that there is sort of this perspective that, if people would just sort of, do what, they need to do for themselves, very individualistic. And then from the perspective of the son, it's very, well, you don't know their situation. And that clearly is in line with a more ACEs science perspective, that there's lots of things going on in people's lives that might enable them or disable them from engaging in behaviors that they, quote unquote, ought to be engaging in. So there's a whole host of science about the notion of trauma and how trauma can affect our judgment and our behaviors. And so when perspectives come into clash with each other, whether those perspectives are about political things or whether those perspectives are about personal things, whether they're, it's about whether there's dirty dishes in the sink. I mean, it really can be very basic or very complex. That's where we get into trouble. From a sort of high level, and so I teach communication courses at a college, and so I'm a communication theorist at heart, and I love that scene for a third reason, because it illustrates this notion of punctuation. And so we usually think about punctuation in terms of periods and exclamation points and question marks, but punctuation really in a conversation means, where do you place the beginning of the problem, right? From the son's perspective, the beginning of the problem was when the father said, right, the world, crazy kids, world's going to hell, and so forth. From the perspective of the father, the problem began when the son said, you don't know anything about this guy's, right, existence. And so if we take that sequence from father saying, crazy kids, the world's going to hell, and then the son's response to that, it's pretty easy to say, well, the son maybe the son could have asked the father, what do you mean by that? Or why do you come to that conclusion? Why do you think the world is the way it is? Or we can put the blame on the father and say, well, when the son came out and said, you don't really know anything about that kid's life, right? You could say, well, the father could have come back in that next turn and said, what do you mean by that, right? But in either case, whether you want to blame the father or blame the son, right, that's not necessarily the point. But the point is that what's the attitude, what's the mindset, what's the motivation do we come into conversations? And can we take a step back? Can we take a deep breath? Can we realize what our triggers are? And one of my favorite sort of guidelines for conversations comes from an organization called the Winter Institute, and it's Turn to Wonder. Right. So when you feel yourself being triggered, when you feel yourself wanting to lash out, when you feel yourself wanting to respond in anger or otherwise defend your opinion or otherwise state what you feel, turn to wonder. Ask questions like, I wonder what life experiences have brought this individual to believe this way. I wonder what life experiences have sort of created the situations, the potholes, the whatever you want to call them in this person's life, and then really listen to those experiences. And so whether that's you in the conversation or the other person in the conversation, right? Both people, there's a, sort of people say, well, the listener has 50% responsibility and the communicator has 100% responsibility. And I kind of say, well, no, the listener has 100% responsibility of the conversation. In other words, like, you as a person can take 100% responsibility about the trajectory and the direction of that conversation if you want to. And in fact, there's some really good research that suggests that listeners are in more control of conversations than our speakers. In other words, the way in which you listen, the way in which you ask questions, the way in which you respond compassionately and empathically, in fact, dictates the direction of conversations much more than your role as a speaker. And that's why Jan Bavelis has called listeners co-narrators, individuals who help stories. Like Aaron was saying, that when your kid says one thing and it goes in one ear and out the other, they shut down. They don't tell you very much. They stop telling you about their turtles and their unicorns and their magical places, and they stop asking you to work on puzzles with them, and they stop saying, Dad, look at me, while they're swinging at the park, right? And so there's a lot of power in attention, getting back to kind of that opening notion of listening as being attentive. And what we're being attentive to, again, is two things. One is the relationship, and the other is the perspective of the other individual and how it might be somewhat different than our perspective. So for me, I'm really interested in people on this call, your perspectives, where you're coming from, what you do currently when you talk about listening and communication in your classrooms or in the other settings that you have when you're acting as an educator, those of you that act as educators on a regular basis or administrators, and then what power might there be in some sort of curriculum around communication, because if you did some sort of introspection about how many classes you've ever taken in communication or listening, it's probably a very low number compared to how many math classes you had, how many ELA classes you had, how many foreign language classes you had, or how many, fill in the blank other kinds of classes that you had. We don't spend a lot of time in formal education settings teaching people to do the thing that we do more than anything else, which is talk to other people and listen in those conversations. And so my sort of, fundamental sort of curiosity is what possibility is there for organizations like Listen First Project and initiatives like Listen the Movie to come into the spaces where students are, that administrators are, that teachers are, to start having an impact and to start sort of retraining people about the power of listening.
That's great. Gosh, you gave me so much to think about. Aram, I'd be curious to hear, while people kind of feel free to respond or raise your hand in response to Graham's question, what has it looked like when you've been in schools? What's been your experience? Because I know you've done a ton of school professional development.
Yes, so I always looked at the film as a Trojan horse. And like I said, it's very difficult to face these kinds of conversations and to get people to, twist their thinking and shift their perspective. So the film gets the people's attention, and then it opens the door for this type of conversation. And what I've used is the film is to bring everybody to the same page. What we found is that 92% of students that watch this film feel less alone after watching the film. We've also found that 92% of educators that watch this film are more inspired to be a better educator. And I think that that's the starting point, because it's getting people on the same page to realize how important that one simple act is to the nature of our relationships and our connections. And like Graham said, as school's going back, my wife's a teacher, my mother was a teacher, 20-year school board vet. I've been frustrated with the idea that we need to go back to math, reading, and science. And we need to go start with listening first, because it's the connections that we create that makes those students want to engage more, makes that student want to listen and pay attention to that teacher. And what we found is that when we redefine what listening is, we find that people start changing how they do it, because it not only impacts their life in the classroom, it impacts their life at home, it impacts their life in the community. And we start to see that this skill actually can change my life for the better, strengthen the relationships that I have. They're more inclined to do it more often. And every aspect of the program that we've created are based on psychological principles of nudging people forward in these behaviors. So I always look at media as a powerful way to get people to kind of look at themselves in the mirror. Because if you think about it, when you're watching a movie, you will see, hear, think, and feel for the duration of that movie. So I'm teaching you how to listen just by watching, and engaging with that film. And after that film's over, it's going to provoke you to either love it or hate it. But most importantly, it'll provoke you to want to talk about it. And so that creates that dialogue. Then, using a curriculum that's focused on social emotional learning, we start to deep dive into the intricacies of those scenes that we've developed, just like Graham just did, so you understand more about the human behavior, and the people that are a part of that lesson can get that aha moment. So to answer the question, we've shown this film, launched school-wide initiatives where entire schools, all the students, all the teachers watch the film, and I would facilitate an hour-long discussion with the entire campus. The average screening size was about 950. My largest one to date was 2,700 students. And you could hear a pencil drop on the floor. Because what we're essentially doing, and if you think about trauma, is creating a safe place for people to talk about how they think and feel. And the safe place is created because the film puts everybody in the same place on the same page going, I feel that way too. And through that process of the discussion, the rest of the student body starts to realize, oh my gosh, Jane feels that way. She feels like me. Harry feels like me. Jose feels like me. I would have never, or just watching the film itself, looking over and seeing their best friend crying in a moment that they never thought that they would cry about. That's creating that connection, putting everybody on that same page. And I feel like that act is the listening part, right? Because we're seeing, hearing, thinking, and feeling what we all are going through and understanding that we all feel this way. And through the active listening training, I've trained educators. It's been a part of professional development days. I've even done it with executives, HR executives, because at the core of everything, 70 to 80% of our lives revolves around communication. But what's funny that there's a stat out there that's only 2% of the population is actually taught how to listen. Now think about that. That's scary. And what I realized in making this film is that I've been telling my daughters, you need to listen to me. Why aren't you listening? But when did I ever teach them how? We're asking the students in our classroom to listen to you or to our teachers. The parents are asking the kids to listen. But have we taught them how to listen? We can't expect them to know how to do it unless we teach them. And so this is why I believe this should be the starting point of every single curriculum in junior high and high school and even elementary school. It's a skill that's vital to our survival in communities and our connection and thinking about adverse childhood experiences. One of the ways that we can, heal is through that connection to understanding what our stories are, understanding how they've impacted our life. And in order to be able to do that, we need to learn how to pay attention properly. 55% of the meanings of the words that come, of the meanings of what we're trying to communicate comes from our body language. 38% is coming from our sounds and only 7% is coming from our words. What are we missing? And, I'd like to I know I'm talking a lot, but I want to leave one thing that bookends with what Graham is saying and gives, something for everybody to ponder. What can we do to start listening better? How can we become a better listener? And I use this acronym, and I'm not going to tell the story because it's too long, but Oscar. If you could think about Oscar, then you can never forget how to be an active listener. Each letter of his name stands for one powerful component of active listening. The O is openness. If you go back to that first scene with Josh and his father wasn't open to what his son had to say. It killed the conversation. We have to be open. We don't necessarily have to believe or agree, but be open to what people are saying or communicating. The S is the silence. It's a hard thing for people to do because all we want to do is give our opinion. So we have to be silent if we're going to be an active listener. The C is I think most important, the curiosity. Most of the questions that we actually, ask today are yes or no answers. Did you get the paperwork done? Is dinner going to be ready tonight? What are we having for dinner? That's one word answers. We need to be curious. We need to ask questions that get people telling stories, because that's where we're going to connect and understand what they're feeling and going through. The A is awareness. Look at Josh in that opening scene. What is he communicating that the father is not seeing by his body language? He left the room. His face went dark when his dad said, the world doesn't need him. Again, going back to 55% is the meaning is what we're watching, not what they're saying. And the R is respect. People will not continue to listen to us unless we make them feel like they're respected. And that is done by practicing words like, I hear what you're saying, I understand, I feel what you're saying. That gets people to continue to communicate.
Oh, that's really powerful. And there's just so much. I love this chat is going on fire. And just like you said, it's like holding up a mirror for me as a parent, right? I have teenagers and I'm like, oh my God, am I not listening? Like I have all this anxiety, right? And then also just thinking backwards about being an educator and thinking forwards about how I continue to train teachers. I do a lot of consulting with schools and teachers. And I'm talking with them about building relationships, but am I talking with them enough about listening as part of that relationship building? So you've given me a lot to reflect on, which is amazing. The chat is just on fire. I love, Drew, what you brought up about physicians. I mean, sadly, I think you're right. I mean, the times when I feel least listened to is when I'm with a doctor or a psychiatrist, funny enough, right? That and there's just so much pressure. And Gail, you were mentioning that, we're often thinking in our listening, and I do this all the time, about how am I going to fix the problem, or how am I going to respond and answer, coming from a good place, right? I want to help you. I want to fix what's going on and so then I'm not really listening to what they're saying because I'm thinking too much about what I need to say next. Wow. And Maggie, I love what you shared about having that experience of having the 8th graders train the future teachers. I think that's a brilliant idea, and not forgetting about how much youth are able to do this intuitively. They're such better listeners than we are. And so really being able to capitalize on that strength that they have, the openness they still have, and use them to teach adults how to listen again, like we used to be able to. Gosh, there's just so much great stuff. And Sis, is there anything else that I'm missing? You've been watching the chat for me.
Yeah, there's been so many comments. So I just want to remind people, you can save the chat if you want to get into it on the bottom right-hand side. And then one thing I was thinking, besides a lot about parenting, when my daughter was little, she used to say, if I was like totally dialing it in and checked out, and she would be like, I feel like we're together, but we're not connected. And that was like the clue, tune in. But the other thing is, I've been in writing groups where they teach how to hear without words. So instead of giving feedback on, you could do this to your writing, you could do this, maybe you could try this, it's you just listen to somebody read, and you're all doing a group prompt together, and everyone takes turn listening, and there's no comment, no feedback, but you can tell how much you can feel heard without words. And that's, I think, that's a powerful felt experience that then it's easier to do if you've had it, but if you haven't had it, it's hard to know the difference of what that means. If you do tend to, because a lot of people with a trauma history, we might tend to overreact or underreact because we're reactive, but that to really slow down and truly listen can be challenging. So I love these ideas of how people learned it.
Yeah, that's great, Sissy. And Janice, you wanted to share something?
I did. So this is from a campaign, I don't know if you can see it, called I'm Here. This was a project that was put on by DBSA, the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. I was putting the kits together for them for this, and then I gave them out to some people. I don't know if they're still doing them, but they left me with 100 of these bags. These bags there's a little card in each kit that says, and they use safety pins to put them together, but not with the little thing at the bottom, so that you can put beads on. And this is creating safety in numbers, starting the conversation and spreading awareness. And it's about listening to somebody who might be depressed, who might have bipolar, who might, be suicidal. And the idea is to be there and to listen. So Lara, I don't, obviously I can't get everyone's addresses, but if anybody was interested, the idea is it's a little kit like this, and it's got the green beads, for the NAMI color, the mental health colors. And if anybody were interested and they wanted to let Lara know, maybe I could send you a bunch. Lara, you're in California too, and I could just send you a bunch. And then the idea is that you go and you do this with someone else, and then you wear the safety pin, has 8 or 10 of these beads on it, and you wear it, kind of like how those ribbons are worn. So if somebody wants to talk to you, they know that you're a non-judgmental person who will just listen.
Wow, that's awesome. I had no idea. I love that. Thank you. Oh, it's 12:58. How does that happen? If there's anything else that you would like to share or ask, put it in the chat before we go away. Aram and Graham, is there anything you'd like to say with our last few minutes?
Graham, do you want to go first? I have one last thing, but.
No, I love, ironically enough, talking about listening. I mean, it's important to, get get these ideas out there, and to acknowledge that there's so many resources, available, and we try to pull those, together at the Listen First Project, and expose people to things like Listen the Movie and other kinds of ways that people can, not just think that they're doing a good job as listeners, but actually have an opportunity for some deep reflection and potentially some resources for engaging in difficult conversations, so that when they do that with their family, which in our group we talked about, that it's our family that we tend to not listen to, even though they're the ones that we're supposed to listen to, and they're the ones that often get the short the short straw in so many ways. And so how is it that we come home fully energized after a day of work? How is it that we show up for those people that are most important to us? And it's a lifelong journey. It's something that you never fully sort of grasp. You don't get your merit badge and move on to the next thing. It's something that you're always learning to do better, and learning that you won't always do it well, but you can always you can always mend those relationships, and you can always strive to be the best listener that you can be for as many people as you possibly can.
Thank you, Graham. Aaron?
I just wanted to say that the one thing I learned with listening and working on Listen is, when I was in schools, I think we sometimes make it so complicated what we're trying to educate our students on from the social and emotional learning perspective. There's all kinds of programs, character counts, integrity, you need to be this, you need to be that, and the language gets so confusing for youth. I think it's confusing for adults as well. And every step of the way, from elementary to junior high to high school, the language seems to constantly be changing. And so one of the whole points of Listen, the initiative and the work that we're doing around it, was to root everything in such a simple word that people would hear every day of their lives. So it could be the anchor for the behavior change to happen. So it's simplified, and these kids would not forget it, and we can build on it every step of the way. And that's one thing that I found is to be very effective. Listening is something that everybody has heard. That word they'll hear for the rest of their life. So if we can constantly be focusing on teaching the good skills, we're going to be constantly focusing on fostering stronger relationships and connections, which is ultimately going to strengthen our communities. And I think that, for me, is the most important thing, that if an educator can do that with their students, they're going to do it at home too. If you're interested in learning more about Listen the Movie, you can go to listenthemovie.com. I put it in the chat. If you're interested in the trainings or the curriculums or any of that, and bringing it to campuses, we have teacher colleges that are now using the film and the curriculum to train teachers. It's a part of their mandated curriculum, and the teachers love it. And I can put you in contact with the executive director of that school to tell you what they're doing, but they have a class that's focused on studying the film and using the curriculum, so these teachers understand everything that they're going to be encountering when they get to be a teacher. And you can contact directly at info@listenthemovie.com if you have any questions, and many of you haven't watched it. If you do watch it, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And lastly, I want to thank ACES Connection, Laura, Jane, Sis, everybody and Jenna for making this possible. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. That's it for this week. I hope you all take good care of yourself until next week. Next week, we're going to talk about facilitating grief conversations with staff. Something that I know has come up over and over. So please come back next week. And until then, be well. See you all. Bye.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Aaron and Graham.
Yes, thanks, staff.
Everybody.